That's weird. Okay. Thank you for those that braved the rain. Real commitment. So we're just doing a short 2-week series, as we explained, this week and next week, and then we'll take a little break, and I'll explain to you. I'll share with you the topic after that. So this top series came about because when we did the series on the 10 Commandments, so one of the weeks we did the commandment of not murdering, and in the middle of that session we had a discussion on morality of death and how you define death. It's not just about murdering someone, but the sanctity of life in Judaism is such that sometimes even shortening someone's life who's not so functional for a short time might be technical murder, and so on and so forth, right? So we talked about some morality issues, and there seemed to be a lot of interest. I said we do 2 weeks on some moral dilemmas around the concept of keeping someone alive or not keeping someone alive, and so on. So today I'm going to give you a scenario, not so much the end of life story. It's more about an ethical medical issue, which is a fascinating story and a fascinating basis for discussion. Very different style to what we normally do, but it's just very interesting. And the session today I'm actually basing on a shiur that was given by Rabbi Dr. Kiva Tatz. Some of you might know him. You know him? Good. He's a doctor and a rabbi, or he was a doctor, then became a rabbi. Very smart guy. And I'll just sort of explain some of the terminology and some of the issues, and mix in a few other things, but that's what it's based on. So I want to give 2 important introductions to this discussion, something we did a number of years ago when we did some moral dilemmas. Jewish halachic law doesn't deal with emotions. It's important to understand. And that's a complication sometimes, especially in these issues, right? Because sometimes something happens, we respond emotionally, and that's okay, that's what humans beings do. And we kind of think the answer lies in what we feel, right? Now it doesn't work like that. Not always what we feel is so wrong, but as we've explained many times, the definition of morality in Judaism is what Rabbi Sachs calls absolute morality. In other words, a morality that comes objectively from a higher transcendent source, right? That's what morality is. That's what we believe in. That's what we believe in the Torah. It was given at Sinai, comes with its values and definition of morality. Morality is not always about, am I hurting someone or not? It often is, but not always. It's about what is intrinsically right or what is intrinsically wrong. And some of those guidelines of morality are not necessarily things that we understand, because they don't come from us, they come from a higher source. Because when you respond to something emotionally, right, it's us, and therefore it's subjective. So I might have one set of emotions, you might have a second, I might come to one conclusion, you might come to another. And they're different. And that's the problem with subjective morality, because it varies from year to year, from generation to generation, from place to place. And therefore, that's not the way the Torah way is, the Jewish way is. The Jewish way is that we believe in a set of values, the evolution and development of halakha, and those are the conclusions that we follow, whether we feel that way or not. Now, the interesting thing about it, especially with very personal and very, very hard decisions, is that on the one hand, it's a very difficult thing to do, to go against your emotions and to do something just because it's right, or just because you believe it's right. Yeah. On the other hand, it's actually very liberating, because often when people do things emotionally, they do it based on their emotions at that time, right? Because emotions change not just from person to person, but also within the person themselves. So you do something based on your feelings and your response at that particular moment, but later on, and I've seen this with people, later on you have lack of clarity, you doubt yourself, sometimes there's guilt that comes into it, all of these different things. Whereas if you follow a system which you believe to be transcendent and godly and divine, then you take away that guilt simply by making the decision to follow what that transcendent moral compass is guiding you to do. Yeah, does that make sense? And therefore it removes doubt. Because I'm not making this up, I'm not following what I think, I'm not making what my feelings are telling me. I'm following an absolute, objective formula of morality, and therefore that's what my decision is based on, irrespective of what I feel, and therefore that's the decision I make, and I know that's the right thing, and therefore I don't have to feel any doubt or guilt later, notwithstanding my feelings might not change, right? So it doesn't mean it's easy, but it does mean that it removes that element of doubt or guilt, because you know you're following that moral compass. That's the first introduction. Second is, on the other hand, this sounds like it's always very clear, and it's not. There are still very gray areas, right? Because that's how halakha works. For the reason, just I want to give you a little bit of a synopsis of how the process works, right? And we'll see it throughout today's session, but not everything is clear cut. Not everything is written in the Torah, right? The principles are, the precedents are, the guidelines of how to figure it out are, but sometimes you've got to interpret. Those that are qualified to interpret, the legislators throughout the time of the Talmud and so on, and even beyond. And sometimes the interpretation is somewhat based on one's way of interpretation or explanation. And as long as you follow the guidelines with which you were given, there are sometimes different bodies of halakha that can arrive at different conclusions. Okay? Which makes it confusing, because I'm trying to do what's right, I'm trying to follow a concrete, objective, transcendent code of morality, and suddenly with this particular question there seems to be a dispute, right? You'll see it play out at the end of today's scenario actually. But that doesn't matter, because there's a system of how that the code of morality that we're given tells us how to deal with that. So throughout the ages, in the Talmudic times, there was a system of how eventually you arrive at a definite ruling, how you rule in favor of one over the other, and that becomes binding. And that sometimes took time, particularly during the post-Second Temple, where the Sanhedrin had somewhat fragmented. I'm summarizing something that takes a long time to say, but I'm just, because I want to get to the point. But so there were times that there were like different schools of thought, like the school of Shammai and the school of Hillel. Eventually they could convene and they could create a Sanhedrin. They come together, they could vote. And then when they voted, they would follow the majority, and that would become the halakha. We believe that becomes therefore the halakha, that becomes the will of God. Because that's what God gave us the system to do, and He said you follow the majority. Nowadays it's a bit more complicated. We don't have a Sanhedrin, and therefore we can have different schools of thought, not with lots of things, but sometimes with very serious things, and they're not resolved, so it becomes a dispute. And therefore the system is, it doesn't matter. You have to follow your community, your rabbi, your halachic authority. And that could be different to what someone else might do, but it doesn't matter. You have a consistent source of halakha. That's who you follow, that's your go-to, and that's how you decide. And that's what God wants. The fact that someone else in a different country is doing something else, God wants that too, because He's following his or her halachic authority. Right? I know it sounds confusing, but that's the way the system works. And there are many things like that today that now again, I just want to emphasize, when that happens, it still means it only works if both opinions are following the same system, the same halachic process, which has many components to it. And that is how every new question works, right? And today, by the way, we have a whole library of new halachic literature, because we have a whole list of new halachic questions, because of technology, because of reproductive technology, because of food technology, because of all sorts of technology, right? Things have changed. And therefore, it's the responsibility of the great halachic authorities of every generation, and we always have them. Those are people that are hugely knowledgeable, hugely wise, and hugely knowledgeable of the entire Talmud and all the responsa and literature that was ever written on the topic, right? Which is a lot. And they then interpret that and put that together. And sometimes the system gives room. You follow exactly the system the halakha dictates us to follow, which was given to us by Sinai, from Sinai, and it still gives room for different opinions, and today it's very hard to reconcile those opinions, but it doesn't matter. I'll give you a quick example so you just understand how this works, right? In food production, I'm specifically choosing a simple example because it's just easy to do it quickly, and then we can go to the topic of today, right? In a couple of centuries ago, in food production, they discovered gelatine, the use of gelatine, right? Gelatine became a huge halachic problem because often gelatine is derived from pig or from any other kosher animal, or even if it's derived from a kosher animal, that kosher animal wasn't shechted properly and wasn't prepared properly, right? So can you use it? Is it kosher, right? Now, without going into the specifics, obviously the first thing you do in such a case is, when this new question comes up, you go back to the Talmud. Where in the Talmud does that works? And sometimes, by the way, there's some fascinating stuff, how you always find a source in the Talmud to start with, the starting point. Everything. Hasn't yet happened that you don't find something in the Talmud, right? To start with, if you analyze the question properly. So it goes into a part of a Talmud where if you have parts of an animal that are not edible, for example, bone, you crush a bone from a non-kosher animal, and it's completely non-edible, and someone ingests it, it doesn't mean you've eaten non-kosher because it's not edible. And then the Talmud goes through a whole thing where what happens if something, the question then became about if something was not edible, but then it was edible and then became non-edible and then became edible again. Did the phase of non-edible render it kosher then, right? Which is very much connected to the whole source of gelatine, with all other details and lots of different responses and discussion around how you interpret the different commentaries in the Talmud and so on. And what was the end result? The end result was that there were two schools of thought. That's the bottom line, right? And what happened was, I'll just tell you historically, it was very interesting because it's something that happened in our generation. What happened was that, I think I got this way around, the right way around, that in Israel, they ruled that gelatine is kosher, the rabbis of Israel, and in America, there was a group of like Rabbi G and others, they ruled that it was not permissible, right? And for a while, the Americans who followed their rabbis ate gelatine and the Israelis didn't, right? Now, which one was right, which one was wrong, which one was eating kosher, which one was eating non-kosher? The answer is they were both right, because that's how the system works. If it's unresolved and there's legitimate bodies of halachic authoritative sources that hold different opinions, you follow who you follow. And that's okay. God says that's what you do. That's the system. They did change it at the end because it shifted only because of a practical reason. Because with import and export, it became hugely confusing for everyone. And therefore, there was an agreement. I think I got the American Israel the right way around. Could be the other way around. But whoever said it was permissible decided to follow in their kashrut authorities and so on and so forth. They decided to follow the one that it's not okay, because just to save confusion with importing the stuff and all that, right? So today, all kosher agencies will not use non-kosher gelatine, but now there's so much synthetic gelatine, it doesn't matter anymore. But so actually, in the last number of years, the question has become highly irrelevant. But it doesn't matter. That's just to show you how the process works, right? And that's sort of on a low-level idea, but there can be things in very, very serious things, like an organ donation, all these things. It doesn't matter. So if it's not resolved and there's different schools of thought, you follow who you follow. Okay. So let's go to the question today. Let me create the scenario for you. This is Rabbi Tatz's scenario. He wasn't there, but apparently it was a story that really happened. And it was a long time ago in South Africa, and the question was asked by a young Jewish observant medical student who was working in a very big hospital in Johannesburg. It was like an emergency department, which had a department. I don't know which hospital. I think it was maybe the General Hospital. It was a very serious hospital and a very good hospital at the time. Not today, but it was a very good hospital then. And it was a department that dealt with serious accidents. Okay. What they called it, advanced accident service. They had helicopters. They serviced a large part of the country, and people came in there all day. Right. This department back then, they had different machinery and different things that would help people and be able to care for people, but they got a very advanced, I'm not sure what it was, but some sort of resuscitating ventilator machine or something like that, right? Only one. And they gave a very fascinating thing. They gave the following instructions: that the doctors were not to use it on patients that were not salvageable. In other words, a person comes into the hospital very, very badly injured, but either it's known that he has another terminal illness and anyway he's going to die in a month or two, or it's just so bad that it's not salvageable. You'll help him for a couple of hours, you'll help him for a day maybe, but it's medically clear that he's not going to make it, right? They should not use that. They should use whatever they were using till now, but they should not use this new machine. Why? Because if, let's say, on every given day, let's just paint the scenario. 8 o'clock a.m., you're on duty. They wheel in a very injured patient who's not going to survive. But the probability is, and in that case, the statistical almost certainty was, that a new patient will arrive. There will be a patient that will come that is salvageable, meaning he's just badly injured, but he will survive and it will be okay if you use the machine. And then the machine won't be available for the salvageable patients, right? And you can't switch off the machine for the first patient. Why not? This is the hospital talking. The hospital said you can't switch off the machine if you're already using it for the first patient because the family is going to object. Okay? The family is going to go crazy. What do you mean? The machine's on right? Which, by the way, has no bearing halachically. The instruction happened to be correct. The question is the whole instruction was correct, but this part is correct. You can't turn off the machine for a different reason, but actually, whether the family objects or not has nothing to do with halacha. Which is, by the way, in life and death issues, this is a very painful experience sometimes, right? Where, let's say families who are committed to do halacha, or the hospital is in Israel, there's some halachic hospitals, and so on and so forth. They need to decide halachically what to do in many, many cases, irrespective. There are very rare occasions where you take into account family decisions, but actually, it's totally irrelevant. It's got to do whether you're allowed to do it or you're not allowed to do it, right? Which can be often result in huge emotional scenes if it's very painful situations. But that's the point, right? Now, it happens to be that halachically you also can't turn off a machine, no matter who the next patient is, because this is a principle we have in halacha, a really, really important principle. There are times that you don't need to intervene when someone is terminally ill or about to die. There are cases like that, and that's a whole separate discussion. One thing is always clear, however. You cannot actively hasten someone's death. Right? That's a hardcore halachic principle. So therefore, if you put a person on a ventilator, even though you didn't have to, you definitely can't turn it off. Right? Is that clear? Because that's going to be relevant later. So that was correct. So the question was like this. The question the student asked, he put it to a great halachic authority, is this correct? In other words, 8 o'clock someone comes in, badly injured, not salvageable. But I can prolong his life a little bit. I can help him. So I'll switch into the machine. There is a statistical high probability, or perhaps even a certainty, that while that person's in a machine, another patient will come in that is salvageable, but he won't have access to the machine because I won't be able to turn off the machine. Which is why the hospital told me that I can't connect the machine in the first place to the first patient. Is that correct? Do I have to lose my job out of it? Right? He was very concerned. Do I have to obey orders? Should I defy orders? What must I do? Which I just want to add in one element to this, and that is the principle of listening to the law. Right? So we have a principle in halacha called dina de malchuta dina. The law of the land is halacha. Which is true. We are obligated to obey the law of the land. These are tax laws, any laws, whatever the case is, right? But if a person speeds on the road, not only is he or she a fool, and it's very silly because it's very dangerous, but it's also halachically wrong because you're not listening to the law of the land, right? However, there's a huge exception to that. The law of the land does not apply when it completely contradicts halakha. So as Jews, halakha overrides the law of the land. So for example, right, in Russia this was a huge problem under communism, where the law was you can't have a circumcision. And it was an anti-Semitic law. They wanted it, right? And of course, those who were really, and a lot of people didn't have a circumcision for that reason, which is why when the exodus from Russia happened after communism fell, there were a huge amount of Russians who didn't have a bris, and many of them went ahead and did it in great pain and great difficulty when they were older. But many people had it in Russia. They just went underground and defied the law, because that's what Torah tells us to do. You have to have a bris. The law of the land is irrelevant then, right? So therefore, the dinner de malchuta dinner, obeying laws of the land, that's not relevant to this question. His question was, if it's the wrong thing not to give the first patient the ventilator, then I'll defy those orders, and if it'll cost him my job, it'll cost him my job. He's trying to do the morally right thing. Okay. So let's break down this. Yeah, is the question clear? Okay. Let's break down this whole set. First of all, like this. We have to assume, because you can only answer, a question is always answered the way it's asked, right? So the details are important, and you have to narrow it down. The question was that there's a statistical, almost certainty that there will be another patient that will need that ventilator, a salvageable patient. That's important, because if we're not sure, then it's easy to answer that question. If it might happen, that's not good enough, because a certainty of helping someone now will override a doubt, even if it's a probable doubt, but of it happening later, right? So we have to assume that the question was asked, and we have to assume that was the case, that it wasn't just a hypothetical, it was going to happen. If I hook this person to the machine now, within a couple of hours, there will be another person who is salvageable who needs the machine, right? So that's, I want to just establish that. By the way, there's only a very, this is completely on the side, he just brought it in, I thought it was fascinating. I want to tell you something where we don't say that. There's one case where we don't say that. And that's in a war. You know that wars have different halachot. It's very, very fascinating, right? The laws of pikuach nefesh and all that, because it's for a country and to save a country, is very different. And there was a question that was put to a great Rav called Rabbi G. It happened, it wasn't relevant at the end, and it happened after the fact. But it was put to him like hypothetically, what would be the right thing to do? What was the question? The question was, there was someone in war, and there was a paramedic who went with an army unit, I think to Lebanon actually. This is years ago. You were talking about years ago. There were unfortunately many Lebanon conflicts, right? And one of them got badly injured, and a helicopter was able, there were radio, and the helicopter was on the way to come and take that injured soldier. It was possible that by the time they got the injured soldier back to hospital, that he would survive, provided the paramedic went along with him. Oh, so that was the question. Do I go with the paramedic who I know absolutely needs my care right now and abandon everyone else, which means in the event that something happens to them, they won't survive. They won't have medical assistance. Or do I abandon him and he'll probably die and stay with him? Now, in a normal case, he was a very, very secular person, and he prayed very hard to know what to do. And his prayers were answered. A helicopter came, was big enough to take them all, and he took the whole unit and he went back. Okay, so it really wasn't relevant. But afterwards, the question was posed to Rav Yashiv, who was a very, very big halachic authority in Jerusalem. We're very well known. And he said, in normal cases, he would have to go with the patient. That is the halacha. You have an absolute definite crisis of life right now, pikuach nefesh we call it. The others might be injured, might not. We hope not. But whatever the case is, right, you've got a definite versus a doubt, you have to go with the definite. But he said in a case of war, he would have to stay. Because the unit would prevail. Because that's the morale of an army. The army needs to know they're safe. Whatever the reason was, it's different. It's just different in a military case. So that's the. But now we're not talking about an army, now we're talking about a regular case. The regular case is a doubt versus a definite. The definite always trumps. Okay? So therefore the question that was asked about this ventilator obviously was that his question was that it's not a doubt, it's going to happen. It's going to happen, and some other patient will arrive, will need the ventilator, who is salvageable. What do I do? Okay. So essentially, this goes into the whole question of triage, right? It's a triage question. Triage, just saying something was the word triage was something that happened in World War I. Apparently, it's triage comes to the word three. They divided everyone into three categories. People who are in war case, when people came in from injury, first group is the people who were going to die, the ones that were slightly injured, and the third one was they're going to die, but if you treat them, they won't. Right? So that was like a kind of a triage system. Okay, so that's, and then of course in hospitals they have triage, but it's not just in hospitals. There are many other There are many other cases. For example, what happens if you only have one dialysis machine? There's not enough dialysis machine. Who gets it? Who takes preference? All these kind of things. Just on the side, there was a crazy case where also about where you direct funds. Let's say you got two places you want to give funds to. Is it like you want to give funds to, let's say, research for something that's really critical, or to something that's not so critical, right? Does one take precedence? Fascinating stuff. There's all discussed in different. I'll tell you one fascinating thing from the Talmud actually. Talmud talks about what happens if you have a shortage of water and there's a stream, and there's a city that lives upstream and a city that lives downstream. And the following scenario exists. The city is upstream. If they take enough water to drink, right, but not enough water to wash themselves, right, and all these kind of things, then the lower stream city will have water to drink, or both have water to drink. However, if the upstream city takes water to drink and to wash themselves, there won't be enough water for the lower stream, right? And the Gemara, one of the views of the Gemara was very clear that they may take water to drink and to wash, because if they don't wash, they will attract disease and they'll land up back in danger. So all these kind of things, right? There's a fascinating discussion also about if there's a limited amount of funds, right, that you want to give to a city, and there's urgent things, and then there's like parks and things like that, right? So can someone say, I want to donate money, but it has to go for parks? When I know there's some really urgent things that are needed, and there's a very fascinating response on this. Like sometimes, no, you can donate to parks because sometimes the overall morale of a town, of a city is very important, like, all this kind of stuff. Okay, so this is a very, very big and huge question. Fine. Now, in order to understand this, what we have to do is we have to create certain scenarios and create certain rules, right? So there's certain definite rules that we know about, halachically, and then you have to see what happens if the rules conflict with each other, and you'll see in a second. So, you walk into a room, you're a paramedic, or you have first aid training, and there's two people that have just been injured and they're lying on the floor. Who do you treat first? All is equal, they're both equal. And the question is, what does worst one mean? Like we'll soon see. Okay.
The younger one.
Sorry?
The one that's younger.
Yeah. Young and old hardly plays a role in halacha. Hardly. Doesn't matter how many years a person has left and what kind of cure for cancer they can discover. It makes no difference. A life is a life. That's very important in Judaism. It makes a difference in a scenario I'll tell you in a second, but go on.
A relative, you choose a relative.
No, they're not relatives. They're both not relatives. We'll talk about relatives in a minute. The answer is the one that's closer to you.
The one there?
Closer to you. Very simple. Sorry?
Physically close.
Physically closer, yeah. So again, that's the scenario. Walk into the room, there's two patients, one's lying here, one's lying there. Right? So if all is equal, closer. Why is closer? Because it's a mitzvah to save a life, right? Everything we do is based on what we guide us to do, right? It's a mitzvah to save a life. We have a principle in halakha, not only in saving lives. We have a principle in halakha that you're not supposed to ein ma'avirin ala mitzvot. You're not supposed to bypass a mitzvah to get to another mitzvah. Right? You must do the mitzvah that's in front of you. We have it in all kinds of scenarios. You know that men during the week put on a talit and tefillin, right? Yeah, in the morning. Put on talis and tefillin. Talis comes first, tefillin comes second for whatever reason. But the halakha is you have to set up your talis bag that when you put your hand in, you come to the talis first. Because if your talis is at the back and you want to put the talis before the tefillin and you put your hand over the tefillin to get to the talis, you're skipping over a mitzvah. You're not supposed to do that. Okay? In 1949, apparently, in Hadassah Hospital, there was a case of a bunch of babies who had meningitis. Penicillin was a developing thing. And not every hospital had a lot of penicillin. And they had penicillin only for 2, and there were 6 to 8 kids who had meningitis. And there was this huge question, what do they do? Right? They consulted the American Halachic Authority, a very, very famous rabbi called Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. And he said, it's very simple. Walk into the ward and just give it to the first 2. That's what you got to do. You have to administer, right? Not a decision. It's all equal. They're all random babies. They all have the same sickness. They all need penicillin. You can't save them all. That's just a fact, unfortunately. can hope for a miracle. But the hard fact is you can't. So they're all in a ward. Walk into the ward, I'll just give the first two.
You want to sleep by the door, huh?
Sorry?
You're just going to stay by the door.
Well, it doesn't always work. We'll soon see. Okay. Now, next scenario. You walk into a room. Two people are injured, and one's on the right, one's on the left. They're equidistant. Okay? They're equidistant. But one's your brother and one isn't. Okay? What do you do first? Your brother, right? You're right. Why are you right? There's a principle in Torah which is interesting. There's a pasuk, a verse in the Torah that says, "Mipsarcha al titalem." Do not hide from your own flesh. And by the way, this is a halakha in many things. People are not aware of that, right? You know that's halakha in charity also, right? In Jewish law, there's a concept, of course, where people can give to multiple charities and they can give to charities of their own heart and all that kind of stuff. That's all true, but there's actually a pecking order. There's a priority of how you give charity, right? And by the way, this discussion is a big discussion today because it's become very relevant. So, for example, giving to Israel is very, very important, but also the normal priority of tzedakah is that your city comes first. Does it come first over Israel? That's the whole question, and it's not so simple, and that's why sometimes people to Israel, right? I mean, sometimes you need to do both, but that's an interesting discussion. But if someone has a poor relative, for example, right? Someone has a nephew, a brother, a brother-in-law, whatever, okay, so that's fall on very hard times. And you can help them, but you don't have enough funds to give everything, right? But there's a city issue that needs, or a fund that needs, right? Giving to your family member is more tzedakah. You know the English saying, right? Charity begins at home. Yeah? Now, this is again, these things have a lot of details. This is assuming that it's tzedakah. In other words, assuming it's not because he's fallen on hard times and he can't afford a very, very fancy car. But he's living okay. That's not tzedakah. But tzedakah means he's finding it difficult, right? He or she comes before, so it's your relative, then your city, all different types of things. Same thing with this. If you can help two people, as selfish as it might sound, but you just can't help both. You can can't help both at the same time at least. The precedence goes to a relative. So in that case, the brother comes first, right?
Equidistant and it's not a brother?
I guess you got to start with one. I don't know. I guess you just do whatever. I'm not sure actually what the answer is.
You might be thinking about, I can actually help this one, but I can't help that one.
Sorry?
They're not going to have equal profit.
Yeah, correct. Maybe, yeah, come here. Okay, now, so we have two principles so far. Karov means what's closer to you physically, and a relative. That's great when they're in two separate scenarios. Now what happens and this often happens in halakha, when you have two principles that conflict. No, you walk into a room and there's two people lying on the floor and they're injured. One's your brother, one's not. They're not equidistant, and the brother is further away. So now you've got two principles to tend with, correct? Karov is a principle, you got to do what's first. You can't override a mitzvah. Helping a relative takes precedence. Which one do I do? Right? So here's a fascinating thing. Actually, the brother comes first before the principle. Treating a relative takes precedent over the principle of not stepping over a mitzvah. Right? However, Rav Moshe Feinstein points out a fascinating thing. That you can step over the first person to get to your brother, only if the first person is not conscious. If the first person is conscious, you cannot do that. Why? Listen to this. It's fascinating. These things are unbelievable, the way they think and the way, right? Because if you step over a conscious person, you are inflicting despair. Right? Despair is lethal. A person in that situation, giving them despair, it can be considered actively shortening their life. In other words, if they're not conscious, you can ignore them to get to your brother because the principle of helping a brother takes precedence of the principle of helping someone that's close. Understand? But you can't actively kill any of them. Because anything you do that actively shortens a person's life, doesn't matter for how long they were going to live anyway, doesn't matter if they're not salvageable. To actively shorten a person's life is a huge issue. Right? Not a huge issue. It's forbidden. It's considered an act of murder, halachically.
What happens if there's two relatives?
Okay, one second. So there's precedence of relatives. Okay. So right. So therefore, the core principle is you can skip over the closer one to get to the distant one who's your brother, but not if the close one is conscious, because then you'll be committing an active act of shortening the life because you're inducing despair, and therefore you can't do it. You got to treat the first one first, even though it's not your brother, right? By the way, this principle has been used in halakha, and it is used in halakha, right? Because there's a whole body of law about we do this, and hospitals do this. Sometimes, often they do it in the right way, meaning halachically way, where patients who are in a tremendous pain and they have terminal illness are given morphine, right? Now, I don't know if you know this, but morphine will shorten someone's life. There's ongoing morphine might very, very likely will mean that their life will be, they're going to die anyways the next few days, but it might make it a bit shorter. And that's the question. Really, you're not allowed to, pain is not a reason to kill someone, right? Just because the person's in pain. So the question is, do you let the person lie there in pain, or can you give them morphine, which might mean actually shortening the life? The reason we give morphine is this, because we say that actually pain is not just the issue of pain, but actually tremendous pain is also a form of shortening life. It'll also shorten their life. And therefore we're allowed to give, there's all kinds of conditions that come with this. It has to be administered by someone who's an expert, who knows what they're doing, and it's got to be administered in a way where you just give enough to make them comfortable but not to kill them immediately, in other words, short term, and all that kind of stuff. Okay. So that's why there are other things then, in other words, there are other things that Allah considers acts of killing in a way, which are not, you're not giving a person poison, you're not shooting them, you're not putting a sword in their heart, but you're doing something to them if you're inflicting pain or if you're inflicting despair, which was the amazing ruling of Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. That is a form of shortening someone's life. And therefore you can't do that if they're conscious. But if they're not conscious, the principle of helping a relative comes before the principle of not skipping over a mitzvah. By the way, we have that in halakha a lot. When two halakhic principles conflict, we take guidance from halakha, which one comes first. Okay.
It's very interesting what happens, that's the Jewish law. What about the law?
I don't know what the law is. We're talking about Jewish law now.
Yeah.
No, I guess this was this person's question. Because if you come to, so this is a huge issue for someone, right? If you come to a conclusion that something is absolutely mandated by Jewish law in medical stuff, but it conflicts the law of the land, then the doctor has a very big ethical dilemma on his hand. And it might be in some cases it has to resign.
But do we have any say in, like, if there's one machine, two people?
No, we'll get to the one machine, two people in a second, what the answer was. But I was going to tell you about say. So we don't have much of a say in the country, but we do have a say. And this is actually something maybe we'll do another time. It's a very painful subject. Should I bring it up? I suppose we should, yeah. Because we actually need a lot of education in this, because the end of life decisions are very, very complicated. And palliative care, I don't know what goes in the rest of the world, but I can tell you the palliative care a lot of times here does things that are not halachically correct. And they pressure families to do it a lot of times, right? And the pressure families because often they actually need the bed. Sad to say, but that's the way it works, right? And there is and maybe we'll do this one day, there needs to be a lot more education around what the things you have to do, what things you don't have to do. Sometimes it's really silly things, but yeah, but families do have a say. And that's what's important, that families are a bit educated about these matters. Sometimes they're very complicated, or at least they know who to ask and they'll take guidance for, and they can insist on certain things. But I don't want to go into it now because it's very complicated. Maybe we'll do it or we'll get someone else to talk about it, because actually would be a good thing to educate people, because sometimes they pressure families. It's nothing to do with the law. It's got to do with what just they want to do. They're not doing anything illegal, but they're not. If they would listen to you, they wouldn't be doing anything illegal either. So that's an interesting question. All right. Let's go third scenario. You come into a room, equidistant. Okay, the equidistant. One is salvageable. Assuming that the person is an expert, knows what he's talking about, is able to make an assessment. One is salvageable, one isn't. Now, what does salvageable mean in Jewish law? We need to define that, okay? So we do have something in halakha. As much as we say that every life is sacred, which is true, we'll break Shabbos for any life. It doesn't make a difference how long we can preserve the person for. It doesn't matter how long we can protect them for. It doesn't matter. However, there is still in halakha, there is a distinction between what we call chayei sha'ah, temporary life, and more permanent life, right? So we have the halachic definition of that is, Chayei Sha'ah means that a person might have an additional issue, might have a terminal illness, where by all statistical evidence and medical evidence, that person won't live a year. He will live under a year, right? Or the injury itself means that they won't be able to survive. But even if the injury could survive, but it'll only mean they will live Chayei Sha'ah, temporary. That's called Chayei Sha'ah. If they have an underlying illness, they're suffering anyways, a terminal illness before the injury, and they only have 3 months by medical. I mean, they never get 100% right, but the general assessment is that it's going to be under a year, versus the other patient who doesn't have any underlying issues and will live for more than a year, longer than a year. That's called Chayei Olam, right? Normally we don't make a difference between the two with all other issues, but when it comes to a conflict, that you can only save one of them, or you can only treat one of them, and it's a triage thing, and an equidistant, and they're not relatives, and all else being equal, but the only difference between them is that one will live Chayei Sha'ah and the other one will live Chayei Olam, you go for the Chayei Olam. Okay? That's very important, because that's going to be relevant to the question that was asked with the ventilator. Now, however, not so simple, because, okay, and so we just add one more thing. And Chayei Olam, now what happens, let's say if you go into a room and they're not equidistant, okay? The closer one can only live a few months. The other one's going to live longer than a year. So the one's karov, that's the principle of karov, it's closer, but that's now in conflict with treating the one who's more salvageable in terms of Chayei Olam over the one that's going to die quicker, right? Now it's another conflict. So what do? The answer is, again, if he's unconscious, you step over the one who's karov and go to the one who's more salvageable, because the precedence of Chayei Olam, more permanent life, will take precedence over the principle of karov. Also a very important point for our discussion. Okay, now, here comes a very important topic, and that's where this whole question is going to come in. So stay with me here.
So all this was irrelevant.
No, it's very relevant, but we have to add in a new component, that's all. We have a principle in Torah, we do everything to save a life. We even break the Torah, right? Save a life. Yeah? Anything, except for 3 cardinal sins. We'll break Shabbos, we'll break Kashrut, we'll do anything to break any halakha to save a person's life, correct? However, there is a principle that there has to be a definite life there. It's called lefanenu. It's in front of us. I know someone is sick. I can save their life. Can I break every law? So I'll give you an example. It's a painful example, but it's an example nevertheless, right? An autopsy in a Jewish law is forbidden, correct? We all know that. We're not allowed to do autopsies because it's called kavod hamet. It's many sources. Burial for us is a very, very important thing. Right. However, if let's say there's a life to save, so let's say in a case where an organ transplant will be halachically correct, and I'm not going to the whole question of organ transplant, like what's death, is it heart death or breathing death? That's nothing. But let's say a case where I can take an organ out of someone who's dead, and I can save another person's life, right? Which means I'm breaking the Torah because I'm cutting out part of his body. That's like an autopsy, correct? Obviously, to save someone else's life, I can break every part of the Torah, so therefore, of course you can. Correct? The question, by the way, of organ transplant, like heart transplant, there's another question. The question is when someone's dead. I can't take a heart out of a person that's technically alive. That's another question. But we're putting that question aside now. The person's dead, but there's an organ I can take from them, and I can save someone else's life. Now. Correct? Of course I can do it. Because that's called lefanenu. It's an immediate emergency. Or I know, even if I don't know the person, but I know there's people on the register they're waiting for this kidney or waiting for this heart or whatever the case is, right? So of course you could. Even though there's an aveira, there's a transgression to hurt someone's body, even after they're. But let's say a person says, well, if that's the case, can I do autopsies for medical research? Ultimately, it's going to save someone's life, right? Because I'm going to discover things. I'm going to do research. I will discover new things. I might discover something. We might develop a medical strategy or knowledge that ultimately somewhere in the future will save someone's life, right? So then I can always do it for research. Or can I leave my will that after 120 they can take my body for research? Koach nefesh. The answer is no, you can't. Why? Because although it might save someone's life, but it's not lefanenu. It's not an actual reality at the moment. It's a hypothetical. And it's probably a real hypothetical. Because it will eventuate in that, right? I mean, it's a good question to ask them, well, if that's the case, how are you supposed to do research, right? Good question. I mean, the fact is that we do research because I think we the only one to have that halakha that you have to actually be buried. So I guess we rely on the rest of the nations of the world for their research. But whatever the case, that's not the point. The point is, it has to be lefaneinu. Now, here comes the question. What is the definition of lefaneinu? Lefaneinu means that the person, I can break Shabbos, I can do anything to save a person's life as long as that life is here. What does lefaneinu means before us? The question is, what does before us mean? And this is where the crux of the question comes. Is it in the room with me? Is it in the next room? Next street? Next town? Right? How far does the lefaneinu go? You follow my question? So there was a great halachic authority about 400 or 500 years ago. It was called the Noda B'Yudai. Addresses this question. And he says, lefaneinu is not in the same, before us doesn't mean I can see him, he's in the same room. Before us means it's just a real person that I know. So, let's say go back to our question. So let's say if a person, 8 a.m., a patient who won't survive, comes in and needs the ventilator. So but he's not salvageable. So let's go back to what we said. So go back to the question. What are we talking about? The two people? It's Chayei Sha'ah versus Chayei Olam. Clearly, right? So let's go back to the question. The question was, 8 o'clock someone comes in, the doctor was asking this question. Someone comes in 8 o'clock, I can give him the new ventilator, I'll save his life, but he's only Chayei Sha'ah. He's not going to live very long. Right? But he's Karov. He's closer to me. He's right here, right? It's on the floor. But I know that sometime in the next 2 hours, someone's going to come in who will need the ventilator, who's Chayei Sha'ah. Chayei Sha'ah, Chayei Olam, sorry. Who's going to live more than 12 months, right? Now, if the case was, let's take this scenario. If the case wasn't the question we asked, if the case was that as he's about to give the first patient the ventilator, there's a radio in, there's a walkie-talkie that comes into the medical room. We have in the helicopter someone salvageable, needs the ventilator. You'll save his life. He'll live for the next 10 years or 20 years, 100 years, whatever, right? I don't know. I'm a doctor, but I don't know who it is. I've never seen him, but I know it exists. I clearly have to wait. Because Chayei Olam takes precedence over Chayei Sha'ah. Right?
Excuse me, isn't that giving that person despair like you spoke about? Isn't that...
Person's unconscious.
Oh,
Okay. Right? If he needs a ventilator, he's probably unconscious, right? Okay. You're right, that would be an issue. But all right? Because lefaneinu doesn't mean it's here. It means it exists. I know the scenario exists. So here comes the question in this case. Interpreting the person might have not known this is the question, but when he asked the question, it boils down to this. Because all other variables are very clear. He's dealing with a patient that's not salvageable versus a patient that is salvageable. Chayei Sha'ah versus Chayei Olam. But he doesn't know that there's an actual person on the way. But there's a statistical certainty that there will be such a person in the next couple of hours. The question is that statistical certainty, is that lefaneinu? Is that considered lefaneinu? I don't know of a case. If I know of a case, someone's on the way, they're on the helicopter, I've been told they're coming, that's lefaneinu. I don't know who the person is, but I know the scenario exists. There's a person there. There's a person who needs the second ventilator. But I don't know there's a second person ventilator, but I do know that there's going to be a person like that coming in. Statistically, I know that. Is that statistical certainty enough to call it lefaneinu? Enough to say, well, then I should listen to the hospital and not give it to the first person and wait for the Chayei Olam. Understand? That's the question. So he didn't say the names, I don't know why, but it was put to so there were three answers to this question. The doctor, his rabbi, his posek, or his rabbi had a posek, whatever the case, his halachic authority, I'm talking about big halachic authority, was a particular rabbi who he asked, and he ruled that it is lefaneinu. That statistical certainty is good enough to be called lefaneinu. You don't know the person, but you know that the person exists. You don't know of a case that they're actually on the way in the helicopter, but you know it's going to happen. So there is a person. You just don't know if it's from this suburb or that suburb.
The accident might have happened yet.
Correct, might not even happen. But you know that that's a reality, it's going to happen. But just by statistics, right? Therefore that rabbi said, it's lefanenu, and therefore you don't have to lose your job, you must listen to the hospital, not for their reasons, but for the reasons that are true al pi halacha, and you must wait, use other machines, do your best, but don't give this machine to the chayei sha'ah, and wait for the chayei olam, which is what the hospital wanted, but this was the halachic process. The question was then put to some other poskim, and there was a view that's completely the opposite, which he didn't ask, but there was a view that no, that's not enough to call a fanenu. A fanenu means you need to know about an actual case. And that goes into how you analyze the halakha. Is it about the person or about the statistic? That's another discussion. And then there was a third view, which is interesting, which I briefly mentioned a couple of weeks ago. And that was from Rabbi Zilberstrom, who was a rabbi in Israel. He's still there, and he deals a lot with medical stuff. And he came up with a very novel idea, which probably somewhere in the middle, but it probably wouldn't have been accepted by the hospital anyway. And he said that you should. The problem is this, right? The problem is you give the ventilator to the first person, you can't take it off. Once on the ventilator, you cannot do an action. Doesn't matter if it's chayei olam, chayei sha'ah, makes no difference. You cannot do an act that will bring a person's life to an end, right? Maybe you don't have to give him the ventilator, but if it's on already, you gotta leave it. So he said, you must attach the ventilator to a time clock. And when the first person comes in, put it on for half an hour. Set the clock for half an hour. Afterwards, it'll go off. By that time, if the second person is there, you don't have to give it to the second person. The second person's not there yet, go again for half an hour. Right? As Rabbi Tat says at the end of his shiur, he's not sure if, time clocks are used in Shabbos observers' homes. That's that's why he thought of that time clock idea, because he uses it for the Christian Shabbat. It goes off and on itself. He says, not sure if the hospital would be quite welcoming of the idea of having Shabbos time clocks all over the place and their ventilators, but nevertheless, it's a novel idea. It needs to be halachically analyzed, because how about if in the middle of the half an hour, because maybe it's not good, because maybe it might happen in 15 minutes. I don't know. So maybe that 15 minutes is not a certainty enough, so it wouldn't be called a fanenu, so for half an hour it could go. That's interesting, but it's an interesting thing. So the idea of this is just to really see how a little bit of a glimpse of the process, how these things are dealt with, right? So you go back to the principles of halakha. It's about, again. Now, as I said before when we started, can you imagine the scenario playing out and what the emotions would be like and what the conclusions would be coming from emotion? They'd be totally different. Everyone would say something else, and everyone would, right? But as I said, that's not how halakha works. It's an absolute moral system. It has a process, has a system of how you work it through and how you analyze, and you come to the best decision, and you follow that, and that's the decision you're supposed to follow, and then you've done the right thing. So that goes back to the discussion we had when we talked about the Ten Commandments, that they're simple things, like don't kill. Every society says don't kill. But they're much more nuanced than that, because it's about don't kill from an objective moral point of view, which means both that sometimes actually it's moral to kill, like in times of war, self-defense, things like that, and sometimes it's immoral to kill, even if it's a case where you don't think it's killing. But halakha says it is killing, and that's all part of the Ten Commandments of Lo Tirzach, and it goes with all of them like that. They seem very simple, but they're not simple, because there's scenarios which are very, very fine, nuanced concepts. We have to know, is this considered halachically killing or not? Or halachically stealing or not? All these different types of things, right? And that was the point I was making when we did the Ten Commandments. But this is just a fascinating dilemma. Next week we'll do another one, hopefully. And
Fundraise for another machine. That's the answer to that question.
that's for sure. Okay.
I had a real dilemma. When my husband passed away, I had to consent to an autopsy because they wanted to find out what toxins were in the river in the hope that it could have
Save
someone.
Yeah, but that could be the fun. That could be the fun.
But it was a terrible
Yeah,
decision
no, sure,
to
of
make.
course. I mean, these things are huge.